It's Tuesday, the 18th day in the month of March 2025. Here are some of the headlines making wave on Nigeria's dailies today. First, let's begin with the Punch newspaper. Impeachment move. Tension in Rivers as Assembly serves Fubara misconduct notice. Rider there says, Tantia threatens security. Lawmakers list 19 infractions against governor. Amechi camps kicks. Details of the story can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Above the leading story, we have Niger fuel crisis, customs, marketers differ as 400 border filling stations shut. Details can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. Wike revokes 4,794 FCT land titles over 6.9 billion naira ground rent. Details can be found on page 22 of the Punch newspaper. SGF distances self from AIDS 10 billion naira fraud probe. Details can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Anti-Tinubu coalition, APC, others attack El-Rufai, Atiku as plot thickens. Details can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Below the leading story, we have Amosun Dangote differ over cement plant demolition. Details can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Military attacks. Electricity workers disco blame FG. Threatened strike. Details can be found on page 24 of the Punch newspaper. Copper who criticized Tinubu under pressure to apologize, says activists. Read more on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. 4 Fed killed in Ogun court clashes. Read more on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Lagos PDP attacks Jandor over return to APC. Read more on page 19 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian, the leading story. Eyes on Rivers Chief Judge as impeachment plot thickens against Fubara, deputy. Read more on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Above the leading story, we have dissociates from El-Rufai's deceptive politics. Southern Alliance warns Obi Atiku. Details can be found on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Threats to arrest Natasha. Anti-democratic. CUPP warns. Details can be found on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. EFCC dogs Chinese, Nigerian for alleged 3.4 billion naira cyber fraud economic sabotage. Read more on page 29 of the Guardian newspaper. Lingering court order litigations trails shells $2.4 billion divestment. Details can be found on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Dangote to reconstruct Itori cement plant, build Olokola port. Details can be found on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. Nigeria Brazil $1.1 billion green project kicks off. Read more on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Attorney General of the Federation lacks power to prosecute electoral offences. Court rules. Details can be found on page 29 of the Guardian newspaper. Debt servicing fell from $540 million to $276 million, says CBN. Read more on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Nigeria's inflation sustained downward trend, slows to 23.2%. Read more on page 15 of the Guardian newspaper. Jandor returns to APC as PDP describe exits welcome relief. Read more on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Nigerian Tribune, the leading story. Rivers Assembly lists 19 sins of Fubara. Read more on page 15 of the Nigerian Tribune. Above the leading story, we have Nigeria's inflation rate fell to 23.3% in February, says Nigeria Bureau of Statistics. Read more on page 6 of the Tribune. FCT Minister revokes 4,794 land titles over non-payment of ground rents for over 40 years. Read more on page 5 of the Tribune newspaper. Below the leading story, we have Order EFCC to revive my seized assets from buyers. Ex-Minister Dezani begs court. Read more on page 3 of the Tribune newspaper. Oyo Ogbomosho Road. Contractor moved to site. Read more on page 4 of the Tribune newspaper. Protest rocks Abuja over relocation of Benue Tribunal. Read more on page 17 of the Tribune newspaper. Tinubu appoints Bishop Kuka Pro-Chancellor. Read more on page 28 of the Tribune newspaper. Dangote begins construction of Itori cement plant to build largest port at Olokola. Read more on page 2 of the Tribune newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story: El Rufai accuses Ubasani of siphoning LG funds to UK, South Africa. Read more on page 3 and 11 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Above the leading story, we have Rivers Assembly's notice of misconduct not addressed to Fubara, says government. Details can be found on page 10 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Many injured, houses burnt as crisis erupts in Plateau community. Read more on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Sowore lawyer accompany COP members summoned for criticizing Tinubu. Details can be found on page 7 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Below the leading story, we have motorists pass night at CNG stations over inadequate dispensing points. Read more on page 4 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. The leading story: Rivers crisis. Assembly serves Governor Fubara deputy notice for misconduct. Read more on page 5 of the Vanguard newspaper. Above the leading story, we have why Nigeria ports are not competitive, says shipping firms. Read more on page 19 of the Vanguard newspaper. Ground rent. Wike revokes 4,794 land titles after over 40 years. Details can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. Court to Attorney General of the Federation: you have no power to prosecute electoral offenders. Read more on page 4 of the Vanguard newspaper. Dangote Amosunbika over demolition of cement factory in Ogun. Read more on page 10 of the Vanguard newspaper. Below the leading story, we have party primaries. NAS moves amending 2022 Electoral Act. Read more on page 10 of the Vanguard newspaper. Ex-Governor El Rufai traumatized after losing ministerial slot, says APC. More details can be found on page 27 of the Vanguard newspaper. Beneficiaries of fuel subsidy ganged up against Tinubu's government at inception, says Senate leader. Details can be found on page 4 of the Vanguard newspaper. 2026 World Cup qualifier: Eagles hits Kigali camp ahead of Rwanda clash. Read more on page 32 of the Vanguard newspaper. And if any of these stories caught your attention, do well to get a copy of the newspaper to read the complete story. And these are the headlines making wave on the Nigeria's dailies today.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts. On Facebook, Housing TV Africa. On Twitter, Housing TV Africa. Instagram, Housing TV Africa.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.